Hi, this is Sergeant Betsy Brantner Smith with the National Police Association, and this is the NPA Report. I have with me a guest today that I am so excited to talk to and so excited for you to meet. I'm going to guess a lot of you already know her, but she is a prolific writer and author, and she has some societal expertise that I wanted to talk to her about today. So, Naomi Schaefer Riley, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, as we were just talking off the air, a few weeks ago, my daughter, who's in her 20s, and I were listening to a podcast that you were on, and you were talking about a book that I already had in my library. And the book is The New Trail of Tears. And I really encourage everyone to read this book and to understand the issues facing Native Americans today. And specifically today, we want to talk about Native Americans and the criminal justice system. But I do want to go beyond that, because I really don't think most Americans really understand the circumstances that a lot of Native Americans live in our country today. So where should we start, Naomi?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of myths and misconceptions out there, as you mentioned. I think the first thing that a lot of people don't understand is what a reservation is. And that's where a lot of the problems stem from. So a lot of people know that we sort of pushed American Indians onto reservations as we experienced our westward expansion. But the laws are different on reservations. And most strikingly, the laws are different with regard to property rights. So the land on reservations is held in trust by the federal government for American Indians. The only other people that we hold things in trust for are children and people who are mentally incompetent. And so that tells you something about kind of the modern way we think about American Indians and kind of the very patronizing, kind of condescending policies we have toward them that actually have been embraced in this weird way. I think, particularly by the left, but not just by the left. I think people think we're protecting American Indians by putting them on these reservations, but in fact, we're restricting their rights significantly, their individual rights and their property rights. So for instance, you can't actually really own property on a reservation. It's held in trust from you, which means, for instance, you also can't get a mortgage. You also can't use the land the way a lot of Americans do. So a lot of Americans, like if you wanted to open a small business, for instance, you would use the land or you would use your mortgage in order to get some capital out and borrow against it. But because the land is held in trust, it can't be used as collateral. And the lack of private property rights on these reservations has doomed them to a lot of economic devastation, frankly. So that's kind of the beginning of what you see on these reservations. But as we'll get into, there are so many other issues that stem from that, problems with regard to education, problems with regard to, jurisdictions and law enforcement. And so we think of these reservations as protecting American Indians, but in fact, we are hurting them significantly by keeping these laws in place.
Well, and in fact, in reality, we see extraordinary poverty, right, on many of our Indian reservations. We see crime, we see suicide rates are in some areas are off the charts. I live in Arizona, and we have a number of Native American reservations here. And my husband was a police officer on the Navajo reservation, and he's explained to me, and that's why he was so interested in your book, because he had to have authority from the tribe to be able to arrest someone, even though he was in the state of Arizona. He was also on the Navajo reservation, and you got treated differently whether you had a census number or not. You can explain that. And sometimes that really hurts the crime victim, doesn't it? Especially Native American women and children. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, just to give you a sense, I mean, one of the most striking things that I talked to people about was, the very high rates of child maltreatment and child fatalities that occur among American Indians. And so I once asked someone, I actually asked three people who were involved in kind of dealing with kids and education systems on Native American territories. If they suspected someone was being abused, a child was being abused, who would they report it to? And one person told me they'd report it to tribal authorities, one person told me they'd report it to federal authorities, and one person told me they'd report it to state authorities. And, these are people who actually are familiar with the communities, and they don't even know kind of where, whose jurisdiction ends where. And I think that creates an enormous amount of confusion. The court, the tribal courts, some of them are fine, but some of them are, sort of just enterprises of nepotism, and they don't have real law enforcement. There is definitely a dearth of people who are willing to do this job. You have enormous reservations that are just being served by just a few officers who can barely cover, the number of emergency calls that are coming in. But I think that, the problems really, start with the jurisdictional issues, and nobody knows who's really responsible, which creates a kind of Wild West situation out there.
Now, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is the federal government organization, if you will, that is supposed to be that is supposed to handle all the Native American affairs in a way that benefits Native Americans. Am I correct?
Yes. I mean, that's the sort of federal bureaucracy. It has ballooned incredibly, but often, as is the case with federal bureaucracy, they don't really understand kind of what's going on in the ground in these communities. And so there's a lot of micromanaging, but in the wrong ways. And, many American Indians say the BIA actually stands for bossing Indians around.
I've heard that before from some of my Native American friends. And
Yeah.
I know that one of the other things I've been told is that the reservation system, if you will, in the United States kind of poo-poos assimilation, right, into regular American society. Is that what you've seen in your studies?
Yes, I mean, I think sort of from a cultural perspective, it depends on the reservation. So some of the reservations I visited are some of the largest ones, and some of the most economically devastated ones, like at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, for instance, and a couple of reservations in Montana, for instance. What you find there is a kind of cultural sense that leaving the reservation is a form of kind of turning your back on your community, and so it kind of spirals. And so what happens is, you do get kind of a brain drain, like, some of the, folks who are successful or who want something more, they just leave, because there's nothing, there's absolutely no legal requirement that Native Americans live on reservations. Sometimes there's a misconception about that too. About half of the Native population in this country does not live on reservations. And so they have the freedom to leave, but they often get this cultural pressure. And so, I would speak to people who, went to college, elsewhere in the country, but felt such pressure and such, they would call home and say, like, oh, I'm frustrated by this. And, their families would just say, well, why don't you just come home? You don't need to be there. And it was kind of funny. It struck me as the exact opposite in some ways of what you find in immigrant communities. There you have this push to, leave, get out, we came here in order for you to, be able to be successful. But in these kind of communities, and I think you can get this in kind of some inner city communities too, is this sense of, no, like everything's fine here. Like you don't have to prove that you're better than the rest of us. You should just stay. Or if you've left, you should just come back. And I think, part of it is kind of the isolation of these communities. They don't often, if you live on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the chances that you even know someone who goes to work every day are not very high. Like the unemployment rate is so high that kind of a typical middle-class American life is something you might only see on television. And the education system is so poor that even if you kind of did want to leave, it's not clear that you would have the skills to do something somewhere else. The schools, again, are plagued by nepotism. The fourth grade teacher is going to be determined by, knowing someone on the tribal council, not necessarily being a good fourth grade teacher. And part of that stems from the fact that there are no good jobs and there are almost no private sector jobs. So everybody is just kind of clamoring, through various kind of corrupt means in order to get one of these public sector jobs.
What about some of the health issues too? I know that's not law enforcement issues, but this is something I know that we see in the area that I live, where we see this, frankly, clinical obesity, diabetes, uncontrolled high blood pressure. Some of the tribes seem to have really uncontrolled health issues. How do we address that?
Well, not through the Indian Health Service, which is kind of the federal bureaucracy that is on, that is present on these reservations. I mean, if you ever want to see why, like, letting the federal government run our healthcare system would be a bad idea, like, try the Indian Health Service, because we dump, billions upon billions of dollars into this thing. And it is, so bad, paper records that are just lost, and doctors, who are guilty of terrible crimes, who are just passed from one community to another. It is horrendous. So many of these, diseases are diseases of despair, depression, economic circumstances. I think there is kind of an educational element there. Can you get people to eat healthier? But they're not so dissimilar from diseases that you see in inner city communities, which is, you have to have hope and want to be able to take care of yourself and feel responsibility to your children and your family. And if you don't, if you're suffering from all of there's such high rates of substance abuse and alcohol abuse on these reservations that it's intergenerational, that it's hard to imagine how you just sort of turn that around and say, look, here's, you should be eating more healthy fruits and vegetables. I mean, that's almost kind of the end of the line. That's the result of sort of turning around, once you turn around all of these other factors.
One of the biggest concerns for American law enforcement is, of course, the McGirt decision that affected the state of Oklahoma. And I'm also a police trainer. We do a lot of training in Oklahoma, and there's extraordinary frustration about the 2020 McGirt decision, which I'm going to ask you to talk about. And then there was another more recent decision this summer that affected that a little bit. But we actually are sort of drawing lines in the sand, right? Because of this Supreme Court decision. Can you talk about it?
Sure. I mean, I think what people don't understand, these decisions are often framed as decisions about the rights of Native Americans, that, they shouldn't have to be, processed. When a Native American commits a crime, they shouldn't have to be processed through, our white system. Or that, if someone who's not Native American comes on Native American land, they should have sovereignty. You hear that word sovereignty thrown around a lot. And again, it is not clear to anyone what this means. We are not going to treat these reservations like they're France. The people living on reservations are American citizens. And I think in all this conversation, people really lose sight of that fact. And so because the folks who are on reservations are American citizens and have been for 100 years, we owe them the same protections that we owe all Americans, which is to say that these high rates of victimization, particularly for women and children on these reservations, are things that we would never accept anywhere else in the country. And we should not be accepting it for these people just because they happen to live on something that we call a reservation. We have a duty to, offer them the same kinds of protections. And a lot of my work now really focuses on child welfare issues. And so the rates of child abuse, child maltreatment, child fatalities that occur in these communities are just unacceptably high. And the question is, there are actually some cases I wrote about in the book where, you would have a federal whistleblower who would talk about, kids who were being placed in foster homes where there had been a history of sexual abuse, or kids who were remaining in families where there was known, sexual abuse, or, kids who were acting out in ways that were just, would set off, not just red flags, but I mean, fireworks in the minds of anyone who was involved in this. And people were just like, oh, well, I don't want to get involved. And so at one point, it was a federal whistleblower who actually said something has to be done about this. And he was fired from his position as a result of pointing out how children were being made to live with these repeat sexual abusers. And I think like our desire to sort of be more culturally sensitive and and protect the kind of rights of adults in these situations because they're Native Americans is, kind of overriding our sense of, protecting the safety of these very vulnerable children.
And that's an incredible frustration, I know, for law enforcement. Children are especially the people that we want to protect. And again, not just in Oklahoma, but in so many other areas. Very often our law enforcement officers are thwarted. And something that I have found in my training, and you've probably found in your research, is that it's primarily non-Native American people that are the law enforcement officers. Have you seen that?
I mean, I haven't done a study of it. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, especially because on these reservations, there are typically federal officials. So you're sort of doing, kind of folks who are coming from the FBI and things like that. And often, people don't want to be in these positions forever. So you get some turnover, you have trouble doing recruitment, and you have to sort of have achieved a pretty high level of this in order to be working for the federal government in law enforcement. And so, yeah, you're going to get a bunch of non-Native people who are going to be working on these reservations, not because of any kind of discrimination or not because of any kind of, desire for white people to be policing Natives more, but because they don't get enough applicants who want to go work in these communities and who are qualified to do it.
It's something that I've found as I look into this issue. There's kind of two types of people that when I talk to them about these issues, I come in contact with. There's sort of a faction of the American public that thinks that all Native Americans either own or work at casinos, right? That it's all about casinos. That's kind of one stereotype. And the other stereotype is that Native American people are living the same way they lived 250 or more years ago on these reservations, and we should just leave them alone.
Right.
Those
are two very common stereotypes and questions that I get asked all the time. I mean,
riding pinto horses and living in teepees and bizarre things like that, like a cowboy movie. Again, what's the average reality of just an average Native American family living in the United States? And is it regional?
Sure. I mean, definitely the casino thing. I mean, if anyone sort of gave 5 minutes of thought to it, they would realize that obviously there are only a limited number of places you could open casinos that would be successful. I mean, if you're going to open a casino in the middle of South Dakota, you're not going to get a lot of takers. Like there are not a lot of people there. You're not going to make a ton of money. But, I visited, for instance, like the Seneca territory, which is outside of Buffalo in upstate New York. I mean, they had made, I think, $1 billion off of their casino when I visited there, 8 or 9 years ago. I mean, it is an enormous cash cow. But what's so fascinating is that if you then go to the territory, these people are not living large, and it's obvious why. I mean, the casino revenues are divided among folks who are enrolled members of the tribe in the same way that welfare checks go out. It's just money falling from the sky. No one had to work for it. And at that point that I was there, I think when you turn 21, they would send you a check in the mail for something like $25,000. Now, you probably didn't have much of an education at that point. You didn't really work very much. And so someone sends you a check for $25,000. I mean, best case scenario is you buy yourself a new truck, but more often it was just spent on drugs or other activities which were harmful to the population. So even in the places where you think there would be more money there, they're still living very hand to mouth, not on teepees. I mean, they're living living in, in South Dakota, they're living in broken down trailer homes. I mean, in upstate New York, they're kind of, old, like, not very well cared for communities. I mean, that's another aspect of the problem of not having property rights is, nobody is taking care of their property because it's not theirs. And so you kind of drive through these places, you're just experiencing a kind of economic devastation. And the myth in the mind of Americans is like, oh, they're these beautiful, pristine places where people are the teepees and the horses and everything. And that's not, unfortunately, what they're like at this point. Just to give you a sense of, your listeners a sense, one popular portrayal of an Indian reservation, which I think is actually quite accurate, was a movie that came out a few years ago called Wind River. Mm-hmm. And not only did it kind of show you like what a typical life was like on one of these reservations, but there was this incredible scene toward the end of it where various law enforcement members, tribal, state, federal, even some private security contractors, all pull guns on one another because of a dispute over jurisdiction. And I think it's so fascinating to see how it plays out in this movie. It's kind of a thriller. I mean, people might enjoy watching it, but I think it's actually enormously accurate in its portrayal of that problem.
Naomi, you research and write about issues like this and so much more. Where can people find you? Where can they find your books? Where can they follow you and what you're interested in?
Sure. Well, I'm a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, so all my work is at aei.org. Also, I have a website, naomiriley.com, and they can get any of my books, either The New Trail of Tears or my more recent book called No Way to Treat a Child, on Amazon or wherever you buy books.
And I will say that anyone out there, and of course, this is all of American law enforcement, anyone out there who is an advocate for children in this country really needs to read that second book and also to see your work, because really children, not to be cliche, they are our most precious resource. And you bring up so many really timely and in-depth issues when we're dealing with children. Quite frankly, we just have to do better.
Thank you.
Yeah, Naomi, thank you so much for spending time with us today. And if you would like more information about us, visit us at nationalpolice.org.
Sam, put the gun down! Put the gun down!
Last year, law enforcement officers were involved in hundreds of thousands of use of force incidents. A use of force incident is when an officer must use nonverbal tactics to gain control of a dangerous situation.
Put the knife on the ground.
In many cases, officers have no choice but to use force when a suspect doesn't comply with a lawful order.
Use of force is always ugly. No one likes it, especially police officers.
Together, we can help de-escalate these dangerous encounters. Help police officers by complying with their lawful orders. Don't attack, attempt to disarm, or flee from an officer.
Use of force is an officer's last option. Most incidents can be avoided by not resisting arrest.
If you feel you've been wrongfully detained by a police officer, then seek a legal solution after the encounter has been resolved.
Let's keep everyone safe. Comply now and complain later.